And with that, I'm going to introduce our special guests today. So this program is going to be moderated by Tom Ikeda, who is the Executive Director of Densho, which is a Seattle-based nonprofit dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing Japanese-American history and promoting social justice and equity. And Densho has been just such a long-time partner and a friend of JANM. So it's always really exciting when we get to do programs like this in partnership. And of course, we also have Daniel James Brown, who is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of The Boys on the Boat, which spent 135 weeks on the bestseller list, as well as The Indifferent Stars Above and Under a Flaming Sky, and of course now Facing the Mountain, which I should note will be available for sale, both the paperback and the hardcover in the lobby after the program or in our JANM store, and we will have a brief signing after as well. So definitely get both your paperback and your hardback, your travel, your one for home today. And he has taught writing at San Jose State University and Stanford University and currently lives outside Seattle, and I think we'll be kicking this program off, so I'll pass the mic over to him.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm looking forward to talking about Facing the Mountain with Tom here in a minute. But I actually thought I'd start by talking just very briefly about my previous book, The Boys in the Boat, partly because it shares some DNA with Facing the Mountain, and I'd kind of like to just spend a little bit of time talking about how I moved from writing a book about 9 young rowers to writing a book about Japanese Americans in World War II. Whether you've read that book or not, you may know that it concerns the University of Washington's 1936 crew team, and it culminates in their winning a gold medal race in Berlin, rowing against a German boat in front of Adolf Hitler and the other Nazi officials. And so it's kind of fun just to see that race. And so I'm going to show here in a moment a clip from the race, and you'll see it for yourself. And then I'll explain why I'm showing it. Before I show it, though, you should know that in this race, these kids from the University of Washington, when they lined up out at the starting line on this lake outside of Berlin, it was this blustery, cold, rainy, windy day. They were assigned lane 6, the furthest out in the course, the lane that was most exposed to wind and to waves. Very tough rowing conditions. Despite the fact that they had turned in the best qualifying time, they were somehow mysteriously put out in lane 6. Don Hume, their stroke oar, the stroke is the guy that sets the rhythm for the rest of the guys in the boat, was terribly ill and would in fact nearly pass out during the race. Adolf Hitler entered the regatta grounds as things were getting going. The crowd rose to their feet, gave the Nazi salute, began to chant Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. The American guys lined up at the starting line, as I say, but when the gun fired to signal the beginning of the race, they didn't hear it because it was so windy out there. So they got off to a terrible start, about a stroke and a half behind the other boats. Didn't know the race had begun until they saw the boat next to them sort of lurch forward. So they rowed out into the Langer See, this body of water, but 1,000 meters down the race course, they were dead last, and Bobby Mock, their coxswain, who's the only guy facing forward in the boat, is looking down the race course, watching Germany and Italy in lanes 1 and 2 surge toward what appear to be inevitable gold medal and silver medal finishes. That's not the way it ends. I want to tell you that when the film starts, you may see the American boat just for a moment at the very top of the screen. They will quickly fall out of your sight, and then you won't see them again until very near the end of the race. And when you do, they'll be back. They'll be at the top of the screen.
Im Achter. Schweiz, Ungarn, England, Amerika, Italien und Deutschland. Zum ersten Mal bei den Olympischen Spielen hat sich ein deutscher Achter bis zur Entscheidung durchgekämpft. Italien kommt auf. Deutschland greift an. Deutschland holt auf. Zieht gleich. Die Wikinger gehen in Führung. Die letzten 100 Meter, das deutsche Boot im Vordergrund. Daneben mit weißem Stirntuch die Italiener. Dahinter die Ungarn, neben diesen England. Auf der Außenbahn aber führt Amerika. Deutschland kommt auf. Meter um Meter. Zu spät, zu spät. Amerika hat gesiegt. Erster Amerika. Zweiter Italien. Dritter Deutschland.
We'll have to get your slides working, but we don't really need that. They won the race. And they won it in very spectacular fashion, coming from all the way from the rear of the field to just nose out of the two fascist powers, Italy and Germany, at the very end. And if you ever get a chance to watch a clip, it's really a lot of fun. But I was just showing it for context. The other part of the context is that in The Boys in the Boat, I wrote, I had an opportunity when I was writing that book to go to Berlin and to get up on the balcony from which Hitler watched that race unfold. And while I was standing up there, I had a sort of epiphany. And I wanted to read you the passage that, that pertains to that. And then I'll explain how that ties to The Boys in the Boat, to Facing the Mountain. So I visited the Wassersport Museum in Grunau, where late in the afternoon, Werner Philipp, the director, kindly led me up a set of stairs to the balcony of Haus West. I stood there for a long, quiet minute, near where Hitler stood 75 years before, gazing out over the Langer Sea, seeing it much as he saw it. Down below me, young men were unloading a shell from a truck, singing something softly in German, and preparing for an evening row. Out on the water, a single sculler, his blades glinting, worked his way down one of the lanes toward the large Finnish sign at the end of the course. Closer to me, swallows flew low over the water on silent wings, silhouetted against the declining sun, touching the water from time to time, dimpling the silver surface. Standing there, watching them, it occurred to me that when Hitler watched Joe and the boys fight their way back from the rear of the field to sweep ahead of Italy and Germany 75 years ago, he saw but did not recognize heralds of his doom. He could not have known that one day hundreds of thousands of boys just like them, boys who shared their essential natures, decent and unassuming, not privileged or favored by anything in particular, just loyal, committed, and perseverant, would return to Germany, dressed in olive drab, hunting him down. They are almost all gone now, the legions of young men who saved the world in the years just before I was born. But that afternoon, standing on the balcony of House West, I was swept with gratitude for their goodness and their grace, their humility and their honor, their simple civility, and all the things they taught us before they flitted across the evening water and finally vanished into the night. Now, the part of that I'd like to call attention to is that allusion I make to young men in olive drab coming back to hunt Hitler down and destroy the Nazi regime. It wasn't, of course, just a bunch of tall, white, skinny boys who knew how to row that came back dressed in olive drab. The boys who came back to Europe were Puerto Ricans, there were Black Americans, there were Korean Americans, there were Native Americans, and of course there were Japanese Americans. And I want to stress right from the beginning of our talk here, and particularly in light of the horrific events occurring overseas, occurring in Europe right now, that the values and principles and norms and institutions that the boys in the boat represented in Berlin were very much the values and principles and norms and institutions that the boys in Facing the Mountain fought for. And all of those things, the democratic values that thousands of Americans laid down their lives for in the face of authoritarianism in the 1930s and 40s, now, again, tragically, are under existential threat, not only in Europe, but here at home. So when we sit down and talk about Facing the Mountain, I just hope you'll keep in mind that both of these slices of history shed a timely light on who we are and what we value in our principles. And so Tom is going to join me, and hopefully we can have a conversation with some video clips in it.
So, Joy, thank you for the introduction and everything and making the AV work. And thank you all for being here. It's really, for me, as I was just sitting there, we're in the Tateuchi Democracy Forum. And I remember it must have been close to 20 years ago when the idea for this space was first talked about with Irene and Akemi Kikamura, and so I've been here several times. It feels like homecoming to be here. But so Dan, too bad that video clip didn't play, because I am such a UW, University of Washington Husky sports fan, and it's such a stirring clip. And in some ways, it's a segue too in terms of me meeting you. I read The Boys in the Boat because it was about the University of Washington crew team, and I was a sports fan. In Seattle, crew is a big deal, and so it was interesting to me how you made what I thought was kind of a local sports story based in Seattle, sort of global. And so it goes to the first time we met. This was 7 years ago. We were both receiving awards from the city of Seattle, the mayor's awards. And I was receiving awards, and I think most people here probably have heard of Densho. So we have been collecting stories since 1996 of the Japanese American community. And the city was honoring our work to not only capture these stories, but to preserve them and share them, to sort of be the story keeper, for these stories that we could share broadly. And Dan was there receiving the award for The Boys in the Boat. And I was really interested in meeting you because I said, well, if you could take the story of the University of Washington crew team and make it a New York Times bestseller, maybe you might be interested in the Japanese-American story. So we sat about this far away on the stage and we started talking. And you did say you were interested. I wanted to get your take from that 7 years ago, what you were thinking when we first met.
Yeah, well, so I had not heard of Densho at the time, and I sat there listening to Tom explain what he's done in Densho over the last 25, 26 years. And I've always been interested in Japanese American history for a number of reasons that have to do with my background. But mostly, as I say, I've always been interested in stories about that generation of Americans that won World War II. And so I was intrigued by, this notion that somebody had collected and videotaped and recorded and made accessible to the public all these stories. So I went home that evening and I sat down and I began to watch some of the oral histories that Tom's collected. And I was just blown away by some of the stories. These were deeply felt personal stories about people overcoming great difficulties in their lives during that period. And the more I listened and watched these clips, the more interested I got. Just seemed to me to open more and more doors that needed to be explored. So I got a hold of Tom again, and then over the next year or so, I had the problem that I thought I wanted to write a book about all this stuff Tom had collected, but I realized that really wasn't going to work. I wasn't going to write a comprehensive history of Japanese American experience.
And as you said, I smiled because I've had this sort of same kind of experience with other writers or filmmakers who come really excited saying, I'm going to tell the story, the comprehensive story. And I think in particular this audience would recognize it is so large. It is so, and so this first year was really, for me, interesting to see how you coming into the story, how you were going to tell it, because for me it's almost too hard because I get so caught up into the weeds. There's so much there. There's so many nuances. There's so many different stories. So how did you go about kind of focusing that?
Yeah. So is my microphone working? Yes. Is it? Okay. So that was the big challenge, was the kind of history, as I say, I don't write, comprehensive histories. I try to write personal stories that shed light on some slice of history that I think needs more light shed on it or that I find interesting. So I knew from the beginning that I needed to narrow it down. I needed to find a focus. And so I worked with Tom over a course of a year or so, trying to find, one individual or one family that could sort of tell at least the heart of the story. And Tom kept coming back with, well, there's 12 more I can point you to. But gradually what I did is I wound up deciding to narrow it down. I wanted to focus on young men, Nisei men of draft age, and their families. Because it seemed to me that all Japanese Americans faced a terrible set of dilemmas at the beginning of the war and before the war. But young Nisei men of draft age, seemed to me to have an additional challenge, which was, their high school friends, their neighbors, their buddies were going off. They were going downtown, signing up and joining the military. They'd go downtown to the enlistment office, walk in, and be told they couldn't sign up, that they were a, quote, enemy alien. And meanwhile, they and or their families were being hauled away to these camps and incarcerated. And so, what were they to do? What was the right thing to do? What was the courageous thing to do? Should they resist? Should they fight? It was an interesting dilemma. And from a writer's point of view, you're always looking for dilemmas, because that's what powers stories forward. So I wound up with a lot of help from Tom, narrowing in on 4 individuals, all of draft age, 3 of whom wound up fighting in the 442nd, and 1 of whom, Gordon Hirabayashi, resisted both conscription and the curfew that was imposed in Seattle, and also, of course, incarceration in the camps. And so began to, with a lot of help from Tom, introducing me to family members and going around and starting to delve into archives, including here at the National Museum, over the course of about 4 years, fleshed out the story focused on these 4 young men and their families.
So let's start talking about these 4 men. And you know, the interesting thing to me also, even though you focused on draft age men, it's still, there's so many different stories you could tell. You could talk about military service, like within military intelligence service in the Pacific. You could go to the 100th. You could do, there's more and more. And so even then you had to focus. But yet, I think you did, and we're going to talk about these 4 men, you did a really, I think, really interesting and powerful way of the men you selected, because they come with different perspectives. And so let's start with the first one. Well, we can just keep talking. The first one is Gordon Hirabayashi. So why Gordon, and what was his role in the story?
Yeah, so as I say, I knew that, you know, I was going to be talking about these guys who served in the military, but obviously one of the things that young men in that situation did was they resisted. And so I thought it was very important to have the resistance story in there. But again, I needed to contain it to one character or a small set of characters. And Gordon really was the perfect candidate for that in so many ways. I imagine most of you know something about Gordon Hirabayashi. Again, Tom had interviewed him at great length, and other people had interviewed him, so there was a lot of material left, or a lot of material from which I could draw when talking about Gordon. So, so I was really interested, you know, in the stance that he took. If you're not familiar with it, there was a curfew imposed on Japanese Americans, an 8 p.m. curfew in Seattle. And one of the first things that Gordon did was to violate the curfew. In fact, he kept notes documenting his violation of the curfew. And I think we actually have a clip of him talking about the decision to do that.
Yeah, so this is Gordon in the library at the University of Washington, Suzel Library. He's with several other of his classmates who are Caucasian. And, you know, every night, you know, they would all study together. And it's like 5 minutes to 8 o'clock on a curfew night.
And then one day, I'm dashing home. Hey, Gordon, it's 5 to 8. I grab my stuff, and it takes about 5 minutes to get home. So I'm just dashing home, and it hit me. A question that I should have faced earlier, it just hit me. How come I'm dashing home and all your timekeepers are still there? It just needed the question to be raised. I knew I couldn't answer it, you know, without saying I can't do it. I turned around and went back to the library. Hey, what's the matter? And I said, well, you guys are here. We got work to do. I said, I got work to do too. I decided if you guys are here, I'm gonna work with you. I'll go back when you guys are ready to go. Nobody turned me in. And I didn't take that until it hit me. And when it hit me, I knew, gosh, I can't do it. That's two-faced.
So, you know, I mean, that's so, part of what was fun about writing about Gordon is he was just such an interesting guy. He lived by his principles to an extreme degree, and he just was a really interesting individual. You know, after that, the time came for Japanese Americans in Seattle to assemble and get on buses, be taken to Puyallup, Washington, and then from there sent to permanent concentration camps. When the time came for Gordon to get on the bus, he just didn't do it. He didn't get on the bus. And so he became the last Japanese American living in Seattle. And what he did instead was he wrote out a statement addressed, I think, to the FBI, explaining in great detail on sort of constitutional grounds why both the curfew and the incarcerations were illegal and immoral. And he took that statement, he went downtown Seattle, and he walked in to the FBI office and handed it to them. And the agents didn't know what to do with this guy. I mean, they were completely flummoxed by him because he just, the thing was, he said, put me in the back of the car, take me to Puyallup, but I'm not going to sign the registration form. His point was he wasn't going to cooperate in this process, and signing the form would be cooperating with something he thought was unconstitutional and immoral. So they drove him that day all around Seattle to different places and kept putting the same piece of paper in front of him, and he kept refusing to sign it. So that night he wound up in the King County Jail downtown Seattle, and that began a long process, legal fight that worked its way up to the Supreme Court. And Gordon spent the war years in and out of jail and prison work camp, and finally a federal prison. So, you know, an amazing human being, amazing willpower, and it was such an honor and a privilege to write about him.
And you really captured his principled outlook. But the other thing you captured in the book was also Gordon as a person. It took a lot out of him to do this. I mean, there were times when, during the interviews, he would break down and cry or tear up because of how difficult it was to not only stand up to the government, but in some ways to disappoint his parents. And so it took a lot of courage. But the other three men, and we're going to go to that, it was a different type of courage. And so I'm going to, so the second person we're going to talk about is Katz Miho. And, my experience or my focus of research has been more on the West Coast Japanese Americans who went to camp, the concentration camps. I didn't do as much in Hawaii because there wasn't that experience as much. And so I'm so glad that you included Katz Miho, because it was a very different perspective for me to see.
Yeah, and it was really interesting for me as an outsider coming into the story to learn how different the experience of the mainlanders and the young men from the islands were. So that was a revelation and very interesting. Katz, though, was again just an amazing guy. He was his family ran a little hotel on Maui. And he wasn't on Maui when Pearl Harbor happened. He was in Honolulu at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. And actually he went up on the roof of his sort of residence hall there and witnessed the bombing of Pearl Harbor from that roof. He was also a member of the ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps at the university. So he and hundreds of other young men, mostly Japanese American, ran across the street, ran onto the campus, and assembled in, I think it was the gymnasium there. And they were issued old, I think it was 1903 vintage rifles. Old rifles and I think 5 cartridges. And they were formed that day into something called the Hawaii Territorial Guard. And so that night, the night of Pearl Harbor, Katz found himself in his ROTC uniform, carrying this old rifle down on the waterfront in sort of an industrial neighborhood in Honolulu, patrolling the waterfront to guard against what everybody expected would be an imminent invasion of Hawaii by Japanese imperial forces. And so he became a member of the Hawaii Territorial Guard and was actually very proud to serve in that capacity, but his service terminated abruptly, and we have a clip of him talking about that.
Okay.
Our group of University of Hawaii students were dropped off as guards over area in the dark on 4-hour shifts. And for 2-3 nights in a row, we were serving as, I don't know what we would have done, because we were given a loaded rifle. We were given a loaded rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition. We didn't even know how to fire the gun. But we were given this rifle. We were told, you load it this way, and this is the way how you lock it in case anything happens. And to this day, I wonder, what was if anything happened was what they were referring to, because not that nothing happened, but what if anything had happened, what were we supposed to do, because we're not giving any kind of orders. A month and a half later, early in the morning, we got called up and said, hey, we're going to report down to Lanakila Intermediate School. And we woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up at 2 o'clock. And then finally, about 5:30, a truck came by to pick us up. We were all fully packed and everything. They dropped us off at Lanakila. We wondered what was going on. We found out that the whole battalion was assembled at Lanakila. And then Major Frazier, who was the adjutant commander of the battalion, came up and told us point blank, right straight in our face, he says, the reason why you are here this morning is because all you Americans or Japanese, I'm pretty sure he referred to it as Americans or Japanese ancestry, because of your ethnic background, you are being discharged herein right off the bat, right as of now, you are being discharged from the Hawaiian territory. Only the AJAs. I'm completely state of shock.
So these guys are on this athletic field in the pre-dawn darkness, and they're told that they're no longer welcome to serve in a military capacity. And there are a number of those guys left their accounts of that morning, and a number of them mentioned that they could hear other young men around them weeping in the darkness. They were so shocked and so humiliated that they were not allowed to serve as other young men were serving. So it was a terrible shock. Katz went back to Maui, worked as a contractor there for a year until, of course, in the spring of 1943, the Roosevelt administration reversed course, created the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The 100th Infantry Battalion had been created just before that. And at that point, Katz was able to volunteer for the 442nd, which he did. And it was interesting, actually. Young men from Hawaii volunteered in huge numbers. I think they had slots for 2,000 recruits, and something like 10,000 showed up trying to sign up for the 442nd in Hawaii.
Yeah. So now we're going to go. So we did Gordon, who was someone who defied the government orders. We went to Hawaii and got Kat's story. And next we're going to go to, back to the mainland, to Rudy Tokiwa, a Salinas kid. And what did you talk about Rudy? Yeah,
so Rudy grew up on a farm in Salinas, California. His family was one of those that was incarcerated. They were taken first to the Salinas Rodeo grounds, and then from there they were taken to the Poston concentration camp. And so Rudy was at Poston when the 442nd was created. And that, of course, created a huge stir among the young men in the camp, because now this question came up of what should they do. Should they sign up for this segregated all-Japanese-American unit while they and their family members were going to continue to be incarcerated in these camps? Or should they refuse to serve and resist in every way they could? And so the debate went on amongst the young men for a number of days after they became aware that they could sign up. And finally, they at Poston, they held a meeting down under some mesquite trees near the camp. And the young men in the camp got together and sort of talked it out, trying to figure out what to do. Some argued that the last thing in the world they wanted to do was to fight for the government that had incarcerated them. Others stood up and said, well, if we volunteer and if we fight and if we bleed and if some of us die in the effort, we will prove our loyalty to the United States, and surely Japanese Americans will be treated better when we come back from service. So Rudy was one of those who stood up and argued for joining. He was very young. I think he was 17. So he wouldn't actually be able to serve till he turned 18 a few months later. But he did. He signed up for and enlisted and was sent off to Camp Shelby, Mississippi for basic training, and then saw a great deal of action in Europe.
You know, one of the things you captured in the book really well too is the tension and friction between, the mainland Japanese Americans like Rudy, who volunteered and later on were drafted out of the camps, and then the Japanese Americans from Hawaii, and just the differences in how that created tension. But they worked them through. The book does a great job explaining that. They then go to Europe though, and face some of the most horrendous fighting that you captured. Talk a little bit about that, especially that 1 month in October of 1944.
Yeah, so they served first in Italy. They landed at Anzio and fought their way that first spring and summer up the Italian boot, taking very heavy casualties, fighting for one hilltop town after another. The Germans always had the high ground, so they were always fighting their way up the side of some mountain or another. But they gradually worked their way north to the Arno River. And then at that point, they were redirected. The 442nd was sent by ship to Marseille, and then by rail they were sent north to near the French-German border. At the edge of the Vosges forest, this very dark, impenetrable region on the French-German border, mountainous region. And they were given the task of liberating a town called Bruyères, which there's a junction of several highways and a railroad line there. So they fought very hard for several days. It was now October. It was rainy and cold and snowy and sleety. Again, they took very heavy casualties, but they eventually liberated the town of Bruyères and then fought further into the Vosges. And then they were finally given leave to take a night or two to sleep, to rest. So they crawled off and tried to sleep in barns and haylofts and cellars or wherever they could find a place to stretch out and sleep. But on the second night, they were awakened in the middle of the night, told to put their combat gear back in, that they were going back into battle. And they weren't sure what was happening. But what had happened was General Dahlquist, the commanding general, had sent a unit of his Texas infantry deeper into the Vosges, too deep, deeper than they had been reconnoitered. And they had become trapped out on the edge of a ridge line in the Vosges mountains, trapped, surrounded by German troops. Many of them were wounded. They were quickly running out of food, out of drinkable water, out of medical supplies. So over several days, Dahlquist, realizing he had made an error in sending them in there, sent other of his units of his Texas division up to try to break through and get them out. Nobody could get through to them. So finally, in the middle of the night, he called up the 442nd. So the 442nd set off in this rain and sleet and mud, fighting their way up the mountainside towards this group of soldiers that came to be called the Lost Battalion. And again, they took tremendous casualties, really decimating kinds of casualties, fought for days, finally did break through, get to the Texans, and allowed the Texans to get back down off the mountain. They themselves, though, actually were not allowed to come back off the mountain immediately. They were ordered to fight deeper into the Vosges. And so it was several more days before they were finally able to come back down off the mountain themselves.
And so this next clip we're going to show, so at full strength, the 442nd 100th Regimental Combat Team is a little bit more than 4,000 men. So that's 3 infantry units, and then you have the headquarters unit. So after the Rescue Lost Battalion, after Bruyères, Bifontaine, they only had, and Rudy says this, less than a battalion out there, so less than 1,000 men left. And so the men who were killed, wounded, sick, all that was left were under 1,000. And General Dahlquist calls for what's called a retreat parade. He wanted the men to, kind of march in front of him, so he could acknowledge them. But the general is expecting more men than actually shows up. And so here Rudy talks about what happened through the eyes of, I think, one of the chaplains.
The 36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass in review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass in review. So the 442nd passes in review, and like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters, and they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, when I order everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review. And Chaplain Yamada said, this is the first time I saw the colonel cry. And he said, this is all I have left.
Yeah, so this is one of the interviews I've done in the past that always comes to mind. I mean, so I interviewed Rudy over 20 years ago, and when he shared this story, he continues and he continues to tear up because he talked about all the friends that he lost during that rescue, during that month, and how it felt so disrespected by the general on that day. So it was really, really difficult for him.
Yeah, I think watching that clip that was one of the clips I saw early on, and I remember showing it to my wife, and both of us were tearing up. As you say, as it goes on, Rudy keeps tearing up. It was just so moving. And I mean, Rudy was an interesting guy. He was kind of a rascal, really. He didn't particularly like following the rules, but he had this huge heart, and it really came through in those interviews.
Yeah, so for the fourth man we're going to talk about is Fred Shiosaki. And so this was another different perspective. So Fred grew up in Spokane, Washington, actually outside of the exclusion zone. So his family and Fred were not placed into the concentration camps. And so his experience was a little bit different going in. But talk about Fred.
Yeah, so Fred's family ran a laundry in Spokane, in a community called Hilliard, which is sort of the wrong side of the tracks in Spokane, kind of a gritty area. So Fred grew up kind of streetwise and street tough, although he's really he just passed away last year, very gentleman in many ways, really sweet guy. But he did learn how to fight when he got his dander up. And so Fred was one of those who went down to the enlistment office in Spokane, was told that he couldn't enlist, he was an enemy alien, and was absolutely crushed by that. And in fact, so he spent the next year going to Gonzaga University in Spokane, where he was one of very, very few young men still on the campus, except for cadets who were the university was running a naval cadet program, I think, on the campus. But there were almost no civilian young men. So he found this absolutely excruciatingly embarrassing. And so when the 442nd was created, he went straight down, enlisted, was sent to Camp Shelby, wound up in K Company, which is the same company that Rudy was in. And so he also participated in that battle to rescue the lost battalion of Texans. And saw a lot of stuff going up that mountain, saw a lot of his friends die. And so that affected him really deeply.
Yeah, so one of the things I really like about Fred also was he was one of those individuals who could actually share more about what he was thinking and feeling at different times. You know, the next clip we're going to show is, so Fred actually meets one of the men from the Lost Battalion. The war is over. He's on his way back home from Europe. He's in Washington, D.C., catching a train to bring him back across the country. So let's watch this clip.
I was on the train by myself, and we stopped in Washington, D.C. And I was actually, from that railroad station, you could see the Capitol building. I'm sure that must have been the Union Station. And I was sitting there looking out the window, and this GI came out, I think he's a buck sergeant, and he stopped and he looked at me and he looked at my patch. He says, "Hey, you were there for 42nd." Yeah. He says, "Were you at the Lost Battalion?" And I said, "Yeah, I was there." He says, "I was in there."
So he was one of the 200 men that you rescued.
Yeah, anyway, it's one of those things. I could just feel myself getting I was angry, God, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? You know how many of my friends died in there?" And well, he said, "You know, if you guys were in there, we'd have come after you." And I shook my head and I said, "Well," he said, "anyway, I want to thank you." He put out his hand and I turned away and looked out the window.
Yeah, when I interviewed, Fred, as Dan says, he's this very gentle, kind person. And so when he told me the story, I was a little taken aback. I said, "So why didn't you shake his hand? I mean, why did you turn away?" And Fred said he was ashamed. Actually, he said he wished he could have, but all he could see were his friends being killed. And I think there was that comment when he said, "We would have come for you if you were if it were you up there." And I think you saw Fred kind of shake his head, like he was wondering if really they would have come after him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Fred was very traumatized by what happened to him that day in particular. He lost at least one very close friend that day. In fact, when Fred came back from service, he moved back in with his parents for a while. They had an apartment over the laundry in Spokane, and I remember Fred saying that for a while his mother would wake him up almost every night because he was screaming in his sleep. He had, as many returning soldiers do, he clearly had PTSD. So it took him a long while to recover. And pretty much all these guys I wrote about had some degree of PTSD, and coming back and getting reintegrated into society was hard, especially given the fact that their families were coming out of these camps. They often were coming back to communities where they still really didn't feel welcome. In many cases, their businesses had been destroyed. They didn't have a place to stay. So that really even compounded the ordinary trauma, I think, that all returning soldiers come back with.
Yeah, so we've talked about the four main characters that Dan talked about, and so we're gonna have time for Q&A. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of share, in some ways, the impact of working with you, Dan. And hang on, yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit personally what I've learned with my family. So this is a photograph from the Minidoka, Idaho concentration camp. This is where my parents and grandparents were incarcerated during the war. And when Dan finished the book, I'm fortunate that both my 95-year-old parents are still alive, and my dad last year when the book came out, in 3 days he finished the book. I mean, he read the book. His eyes aren't the best, so it was kind of a strain for him to do this. But he when he finished, we started talking. He said, "Yeah, it really captured the experience, and he learned a lot." He said, and we just started talking. But the one that I think really opened up, and I haven't told you this, Dan, for the last, I've been doing oral histories for 26 years now. And for at least over 20 years, I've been trying to get my mother to do an oral history. And she finally agreed to doing this, I was talking to my daughter, I think it was just like 2 weeks ago. And so the first time, because there was this very powerful story that I wanted to really get a better understanding. And so this is the memorial service. I'm going to stand up so I can see this. This is the memorial service for my mother's oldest brother, Francis Bacco. So he's my uncle, who was a member of the 100th Battalion and was killed in action. Actually, right after, in Italy, right after Hill 140, he was killed by a German sniper. And this is this amazing photograph of my grandparents accepting the American flag. But my mother told this story in more detail, that how the family was informed in camp, and how there's a telegram, a Western Union telegram that goes into the admin office, and there it was actually a 21-year-old Japanese American woman who worked in the office, was tasked to bring the telegram and tell my grandparents. And it so happened that this woman was actually a family friend, and my mom was there, so she told me how difficult it was for this young woman to actually have to tell my grandparents that their oldest son had just been killed. And to make this story even more kind of meaningful, my mom talked about when my uncle volunteered to fight or to join the military, he actually failed the physical. And my grandmother, seeing how despondent he was, gave him a Japanese remedy, to clear up his kidneys. And so with that, he actually passed the physical and was a staff sergeant. And then my mom shared, because she actually shared these letters just a week ago, on Mother's Day, and letters that she had been corresponding. One was a letter just 3 days before my uncle was killed. But through these letters, he was talking about how he was, there was actually talk of him becoming an officer to be commissioned in the field. So this young woman who told my parents, or my grandparents, that their son had died. At that moment, my grandfather, looked at my grandmother and lashed out at her, saying that by helping, their son pass the physical, she had killed him. And so it was just this really traumatic experience that this young woman experienced, that she later shared with my mother. And so it was a very emotional kind of discussion and interview. But a lot of it was because the book and our discussions of all this, made me more curious about how were families informed, and how did this happen. Furthermore, we talked more after the interview. My dad was there, and as we looked at this photograph, little things. My dad's a veteran. He said, there should not have been a piece of paper between the hands and the flag. The hands should be, the flesh should be against the flag. And furthermore, and it doesn't show in this one, the flag was actually handed to them or presented to them by another Japanese immigrant. It wasn't done by a military official. And my dad in particular was a little bitter about this, because he said, they could have easily done this, because there were a lot of military people there. They weren't at the memorial service, but they were surrounding them because they were guarding them. They were, in a concentration camp. So my dad, kind of mentioned that as we were talking about this. But, part of getting this story was in working with you and having this book come out. And I think it's been true this last year, as we've gone around and I've talked to a lot of Japanese American families, how much this book has opened up discussion during a really difficult time. And so I want to thank you, and it's been just such a honor working with you on this book.
Yeah, well, absolutely none of this would have happened if it hadn't been for meeting you and particularly for all the work you've done over 26 years. I mean, it's just staggering amount of material there. Not, as you mentioned, not just for me, but for filmmakers and writers to come for a long time. They're going to be able to, and artists are going to be able to use that material to keep the story alive. And it's a really important story, as I said at the beginning, particularly in these times that we're in. I think it's extremely relevant.
So at this point, we're going to open up to questions. And I think there's supposed to be a phone number someplace. And it's going to show up on my phone. I can answer. But as we're waiting, are there any questions that people have?
I'm Mas Yamashita. I'm a docent here at the museum. And so I've done a lot of research. I've read The Boys in the Boat, and I loved it. And I had Facing the Mountain, but I have to confess, I'm having a hard time bringing myself to read it because I've done a lot of reading on, the 442. So it's gotten real. Difficult to read, so I guess I'll get around to it. So just wanted you to know.
Nothing.
Yeah, how many people died rescuing the lost battalion? In fact, I find it hard throughout the years to find out how many died. 33,000 served, but how many died?
Yeah, do you know?
They lost close to 50 and over 800 wounded, but they lost close to 50 men.
Right. So when you add that together, there were about 200 men that they got out. So they paid a very heavy price to get those 200 men out.
They made the state of Texas made all members of the 442 and their families honorary Texans.
Honorary Texans, yes, sir.
So were we able to answer that question? Is that?
No, I
Yeah.
didn't get a number.
Yeah. So the exact number. I mean, it.
I want a number. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
What the U.S.
Yeah,
has on file.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you research that? The author? Who was the author?
Yes, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I think that.
Not a number?
Pardon?
Did you get a number?
I don't have a particular number of, you're talking about Nisei casualties during the rescue of the Lost Battalion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that.
You don't have a number.
I don't have a specific number. I'd have to look it up. Yes, sir.
You could look it up, though.
Sure.
Okay, you can't approximate it? Because I heard on the NHK special that 1,000 died. I don't know.
Yeah, it wasn't that high.
No.
I mean, there have been, in the literature report.
They mentioned right there, that Fred, he mentioned that very few did the march before General Dahlquist. So.
Right, and there have been written accounts that 800 there were 800 casualties, but that includes the wounded and the killed in actions. That, and that number 800, I think, is also a lot of it. As Dan mentioned, there was also the liberation of Bruyères and Bifontaine, and not only the
Lost Battalion.
Yeah, so the Rescue Lost Battalion, as well as the cleanup action. So there's a full month that the unit was actually, kind of out there. And so, I don't know the exact number.
It depends partly if you include the battle for Bruyères. It depends partly on where you start the timeline. Because a lot of kids died liberating Bruyères and then Bifontaine and Belmont before anybody started up the mountain after the Texans. So, it's probably an impossible number to get precise. But again, in addition to the fatalities, there were hundreds and hundreds that were wounded. And actually, one reason so few were able to come to the retreat parade was they had a terrible time with trench foot. A lot of them had feet that were swollen up and purple and bleeding, and just, they'd been in the mud and the snow and the sleet for days without being able to take those boots off. And so a lot of them had those kinds of injuries and disabilities.
And part of the problem with getting exact numbers, I've actually looked at Dan, as you have also, you look at the reports in the from the field and the KIAs, killed in actions, but they're not totally accurate. I mean, when I went back to look at my to find out what the record said about my uncle's death, which would have been July 1944, he wasn't even listed. So there are things like that.
Yeah, I think that's probably universally true of, particularly battles like that were fought in rough terrain and in extremely trying circumstances. It's hard to know whether you've got the right records or the final count from any given source.
And so we have a question online from Brandon. And the question is, what wasn't included in the book that you think we should know about the 442nd story and their contributions during and after the war?
Well, so the first thing, I'm a slight divergence from the question, but the one thing I want to stress is that by focusing on the 442nd, I wind up not talking about the incredible contributions of the 100th Infantry Battalion and the Military Intelligence Service in particular. So there's so that, I think that's important. I'm deliberately narrowing it down to a slice of the pie here. Beyond that, there's, it's mostly just there are so many personal stories that Tom has recorded, but most of the world hasn't actually heard or seen yet. The story's going to be pretty much the same, but there's all the details are going to be different, and they're going to be very compelling details about how people experienced it. I think one thing that I do wish there was more of in the book is how Nisei women experienced this. I mean, I deliberately do weave in the women that were related to the guys I'm following. And there's some really interesting stories pertaining to that. But I know there's a lot of other, I think the experience of Nisei women is something that could be explored more.
Other questions from the audience? I'm still waiting for text also.
Can you tell us more about the research process of narrowing it down to the 4 characters?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things I needed to do in order to tell a coherent story, as I say, is to narrow it down to a small cast of characters. But I wanted there to be certain kinds of diversity. So I knew we needed somebody from Hawaii. We needed somebody, obviously, whose family had been incarcerated in the camp. We need somebody who had, been one of the resistors. So a lot of it came down to making sure I covered the essential bases sort of geographically, and then also in terms of their reaction to that dilemma I talked about at the beginning of the war. And to some extent, that dictated who I was ultimately going to wind up talking about. Again, there's a lot of great stories that are left on the cutting room floor here. There's some stories from some of the Okinawans in the military intelligence service that I really, really wanted to tell, but there just wasn't a way to connect it logically without to the narrative I was telling without sort of blowing it up. So basically, I had to narrow it down, sort of through several kinds of filters. Am I getting the geographical mix? Am I getting the mix of experiences? And the most important filter, am I getting a story that has been well documented, that is, that Tom or somebody else has collected? Are the families on board with my telling it? Are they going to be able to help me tell it? How do they feel about it, and things like that? So all those kinds of factors. That's why it took a long time to settle on the characters that the people that I wind up talking about in the book.
I think there's one texted to you just now.
Oh, yeah, we had text us. So the next question is, can you tell us if you have a new project in the works?
I don't actually. Writing one of these books they're so research intensive. It's 4 or 5 years of research and writing that I never want to do it unless I'm, feel personally called upon to do it. I really feel that I'm going to want to live with this story for the next 4 or 5 years. And it's hard to find nonfiction true stories that haven't been told before that you want to spend that much time with. So I'm not sure if I'm going to write another narrative nonfiction book, but if I do, it'll be something that I care deeply about.
But something I know that you're kind of as a next project. If you read The Boys in the Boat or Facing the Mountain, I think I've talked to you before. The thing that struck me about your writing is it's very cinematic. I mean, it's almost like you can really feel like you're there and you can see what's going on. And The Boys in the Boat, I know of films being made right now. I mean, talk about that, and any thoughts in terms of Facing the Mountain and how that could be on the screen.
Yeah, so The Boys in the Boat is actually in production right now. George Clooney is directing it. I just saw some photos yesterday, actually, from the set. And it's fun for me to watch. They're filming it, unfortunately, in the UK, which makes it really hard to visit the set. But I have a lot of faith that that's going to come out well. I talked to Clooney, actually called me about a year ago, and we talked about it. And I really liked, he had read the book, of course, but he also had really understood it. And so we had a really good conversation about it. So I think, and you never know what's going to come out on the other end, but I think it's going to be a good film. And in terms of Facing the Mountain, we're working with the idea of turning that into a TV series, probably, like a streaming or HBO style series. And so there's some positive things happening with that, and we'll see if that works out or not.
Do you know an author, writer named Shirley Casanova?
Let's go ahead.
Oh,
Shirley?
Well, anyway, she just finished a book about the MIS and the, you know Cedric Shimo, right? He was a docent, and she features, it's about the resistance and the MIS guys, and the Cedric was one of those who, he was one of our docents, but he was in the MIS, and when he finished, they were going to send him overseas, and so he asked if he could stop at Manzanar to visit his mother. His father had been arrested right away because he was a prominent kendo instructor here in Little Tokyo, so they took away a lot of the, and so his mother was in Manzanar by herself, and so Cedric wanted to stop and visit her before he went overseas, and they wouldn't let him. So he said, I won't go. So anyway, the book is about the 1800. You know about the 1800, and the 525th, two groups that they made into like engineering corps. They made them work on roads and things like that instead of, locking them up. So anyway, this was the only book that's about these guys, key-based. Did you know about the squadron of Nisei soldiers in Fort Riley when FDR was going to visit the camp? They locked up the Nisei squadron, and they put an armed guard on these guys.
I had heard that, yeah.
Until FDR left. Anyway,
yeah.
This book, and she had Cedric write the foreword because he's featured, they have a lot of pictures of him in the book. So anyway, I just wondered if you knew about it.
No, I didn't. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, Cedric is an incredibly. I did an oral history with Cedric, and there was a great question that, and so this is when he was with the MIS, and so he was with an early class. So the early classes of the MIS actually started before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and so after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They questioned, this early class, maybe the first or second class of the MIS, what side are you going to fight on? Because now Japan has declared war. And Cedric had this I thought it was a great response. He said, I'm going to fight on the side that protects the people who have been placed in camp. So essentially his mother at Manzanar, he said, so that's the side I'm going to fight on. And with that response, they took him out of the MIS and put him in essentially a unit that were kind of for questionable, kind of possible. So they wouldn't be, given rifles and stuff. They were, like you said, engineers and worked on roads and things like that. But great story. So at this point, Joy, I know the museum has books for sale and if anyone wants to buy a book and have Dan sign it, he's more than willing to do that. But at this point, I think I'm going to turn it back to you, Joy, to end the program.
Yeah, can you all join me in a round of applause for Daniel James Brown and Tom Ikeda? Thank you again to Densho. Thank you to both of you. And we hope to see you back here again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.